Hey everyone, today I want to talk about something that's getting more and more relevant and more important to talk about in the astrological community, which is how do you know if someone is a real astrologer or not? Now, to ask that question, we're automatically kind of asking the question, well, what's the definition of astrologer? Someone who does astrology? That can mean a lot of different things. Now, to some people who've been around a while in the astrological community, this could seem like really simple or obvious. Like, you can tell whether or not somebody knows what they're talking about, or whether they're just somebody who learned about moon and rising signs 6 months ago, and then suddenly they're the next, astro Twitter astrologer, and they're giving little readings through DMs. But overall, this topic is a lot more complicated and nuanced when you look beneath the surface, especially when you take into account how fast our community is growing and how much it's changing. I'm just gonna get straight to the point with this. I don't think there is one answer to the question, what is the definition of astrologer? I don't even think it's really possible or helpful to try to nail down one universal definition for the term astrologer. What it comes down to is this. The title astrologer is self-defined and self-appointed. Our field is not standardized, it's not regulated, there's no one telling us what it means to be an astrologer officially, so we have to figure it out ourselves. And this may come as a surprise to some people, but astrologers don't always agree on everything. So when there's not a set standard, there's gonna be discrepancy. What an astrologer is to one person is not gonna be an astrologer to another, and people are just gonna define it different ways. What's important is that when you do this self-defining and self-appointing, you use integrity and discernment. You have to use integrity when you're setting your own standards for what being an astrologer means to you, and you have to use discernment when you're evaluating other people who are donning the title or not donning the title. So I want to talk about ways you can evaluate whether or not somebody is legit or a real astrologer or not. These ways are also good for helping you kind of explore your own standards and what you think should be the definition of astrologer for you. But before we do that, I want to give some context as far as how widely opinions differ on this topic and give you some really good examples of sort of one side of the spectrum and the other from two women that I greatly admire and respect. So the first one is from my friend and colleague Jen Zart. She posted about this actually last Christmas Eve, and the Facebook post is linked below. Just go ahead and read it. It's not long, but it's worth it. I'm just going to read you a little excerpt. All I want for Christmas is for people to expand their concept of what doing astrology is. You don't have to be a counseling astrologer who sees clients to be an astrologer. If you use planetary magic, you're an astrologer. If you're using planetary hours correctly, you're a kind of astrologer. The point is, if you're using planetary and celestial stuff to make sense of your earthly stuff, you are an astrologer. I really like Jen's emphasis on opening up how we define the term and honoring the different ways that people engage with their astrology. In the rest of her post, she does go into how there are different grades of practice and definitions of type and all that kind of stuff. But her main point is mundane astrologers never see clients. There are so many different ways to engage with astrology, and we shouldn't bar people from claiming the title of astrologer or using that term to refer to themselves just because they're not seeing clients for money. The next post I wanted to highlight is a thread from Caitlin Kopic of Sphere and Sundry. Shortly after that topic article came out called The Fault in Their Stars, you probably saw it. And again, this is just a little excerpt of her thread. Go read the whole thing. She is excellent at articulating her point of view on this. Caitlin says, a good litmus test for if you're an astrologer, lowercase, or an astrologer, uppercase A, are you capable of giving an analysis without having been tipped off by social media or an app first? By reading someone else's take and having important, timely configurations pointed out for you? If you're not, you're an astro enthusiast, not an astrologer with a capital A. Again, this is just part of Caitlin's thread. You should go read the whole thing. She does an excellent job articulating this point of view, which is basically, and this is something she mentions that I think is a great parallel to draw. If you're in med school, are you a doctor? No, you're a med student, and that's okay. It's okay to be a med student and not a doctor yet, but there's a certain amount of experience required and proficiency required to call yourself the thing, right? And it's okay to be protective of a practice that you love and be like, hey, maybe not everybody is an astrologer though, actually. But I wanted to show you guys the difference between opinions here. Jen represents kind of one end of the spectrum. Caitlin represents another end of the spectrum, or another just place to fall on this topic. I will say that when I started out, I shared pretty much all of Caitlin's sentiments exactly. And as time has gone on, especially since I got more involved in the online community, Astro Twitter in particular, I have kind of opened up my perspective and my mind a lot more and kind of softened some of my opinions around that to where I totally respect what Caitlin is saying and hard relate. But I think I lean, on the spectrum, I'm a lot closer to Jen's point of view at this point in time. Another thing that Caitlin emphasizes is that her standards are her own and that's okay. She's not saying this is how it should be, she's just expressing her opinion. So what's important here is not which woman is more correct in her opinion. What's important is that both women are solid in their opinions, they have really good reasons for holding those opinions and sets of standards, and they're willing to express it and talk about it and make it a topic of conversation and explain why. This is so crucial when we have conversations like this. I don't really care what your opinion is on pretty much anything, but be solid in that and be able to explain to me why you think what you think. And own that and be confident in yourself and your opinions. And if you're not confident in your opinions yet, do some more research, open up your mind as much as possible and try to get to a place where you can explain why you think what you think. I think Jen and Caitlin are both really, really good examples of how to be open and forthright about what your opinion is and just be willing to talk about it and willing to disagree with other people in an amiable way. All right, so now let's talk about some ways you can evaluate somebody's credibility and kind of get a sense of whether or not they're legit or not, basically. There are a couple of really obvious ways, some sort of yardsticks that you can use to measure somebody's credibility or eligibility to don the title of astrologer, if you want to put it that way. Those are years of experience and proficiency. Pretty obvious, right? But before we go on, it's super important to note that everything is relative. Let's say, for example, somebody's been studying for 3 months, they just got into it. Someone with 5 years of experience to that person is going to be expert level. They know so much more, they've been at it for so much longer. But that same person who's been studying and practicing for 5 years is going to look at someone like Stephen Forrest and be like, I'm a tiny baby human astrologer. You can't even compare. All the feelings in this situation are totally valid. The person who's been practicing for 3 months is very, very much a beginner relative to the person studying for 5 years, and the person studying for 5 years can still see a huge gap between themselves and someone who's a really seasoned practitioner. So as you go about evaluating and witnessing other people evaluate and talking about this with your friends and peers, just keep in mind that everyone's operating from their own perspective. It is everyone's individual personal responsibility to try to expand that perspective as much as possible, but everything's relative. Two people can evaluate the same individual and come to completely different conclusions based on whatever their perspective is. So just be aware of that and just don't be a dick about it. So let's talk about years of experience. This one's pretty obvious. Someone who's been practicing astrology for 30 years is probably going to be more of a better fit for anybody's definition of astrologer than someone who's been studying for 3 months. That said, not everybody learns at the same pace or in the same way, so you can't necessarily dismiss somebody who's been studying for 2 or 3 years and just believe anything that someone says because they've been studying for 10 years. So while this is definitely something to take into consideration, you can't use this as a foolproof method to evaluate how good someone is. Which leads us naturally to, are they good or are they not good? Proficiency is just something you can measure by reading somebody's work or seeing how they approach astrology, etc., etc. What's cool about proficiency is it often shines through whatever level of experience they have or however long they've been studying or practicing astrology. You can tell when someone is really bright and talented, but they're still just really new to the practice and they don't have those years of experience yet. But they know what they're talking about. They really took to the practice. They get it, And you can tell they're going to become really, really good, especially as they gain more experience over time. My main point here is you can't just look at how long someone's been doing astrology to see how good they are. And you can't just trust that just because someone sounds really smart and picked up the concepts fast that they are really good. You have to take both together and you have to kind of trust your instincts. Now, I will say that this is one of those things where you kind of need some measure of experience or perspective, at least yourself, in order to evaluate someone in this way. If you don't know any better, somebody who just knows a lot more than you might seem super legit, when to somebody with more experience, they might see a lot of holes in their conceptualization, the way they do things, the way they practice, etc. So, your mileage is going to vary on this, but trust your instinct and just be inquisitive. Like, look at what they're talking about, look at their website. If they don't list anywhere that they studied, that's like a red flag, If they're like, I've only been at it for 2 years, but I completed Chris Brennan's Hellenistic course and I own all of Ben Dyke's translations and I've read them all and blah, blah, blah. Like, you're going to know, like, they probably have a pretty good idea of what they're talking about. So just try to use discernment with this. That's the whole point here, is use common sense, think about it, dig, figure out, like, who you're talking to. You can't just believe everybody at their word, unfortunately, especially in a field that's unregulated. Which brings us to a really good point worth mentioning. Some of you may be thinking, okay, so why do we have to define all this ourselves? Couldn't we just make people take a test and then, like, if they're good enough to pass the test, they're good enough to be called an astrologer? Well, we have that. Certification is a thing you can get in the astrological community. So first of all, this could be a whole video or topic on its own. I'm not going to dig deep into it. If you would like me to, let me know in the comments. I'll see what I can do. But basically, the whole idea with certification is what we just said. If you are good enough, proficient enough to pass a test on astrology, you become certified and you can be like, I am NCGR level 3 certified. The NCGR is an astrological organization. They said I was good enough to call myself certified by them. So this seems like a really good idea, and it is helpful, I think. I mean, I don't think it's trash or anything, but it runs into some problems pretty quickly when you think about it, such as who is writing the tests? What do they prioritize on these tests? What if you're being tested for traditional astrology, but you're a modern astrologer and you don't really want to do traditional astrology? Like, there are just like a lot of different things you can test for. There are a lot of different certifications. There are a lot of different ways you can approach that. So there's no, again, one standard. Like, there is no one way to do astrology. So there's no one way to test for astrology globally. That would be insane. No one could pass that. So while I don't think certification is like useless or anything by any means, it's just not a solve. It's not a foolproof way to attack this topic of how do we define astrologer. It comes down to this. You have to do the legwork yourself. You have to define what astrologer means for you using the tools, perspective, and experience that you have. No one can do this for you. And frankly, we're lucky that no one is doing this for us. There are so many different ways you can do astrology. I hope and pray that it never gets regulated or standardized where everybody has to take one test and do astrology one way. With this freedom, we get a lot of room for people to be assholes and scam people out of money and stuff. So it's a risk we take, of course, but I think it's worth it. It just takes common sense and discernment on our part when we're trying to evaluate who is legit and who is not. And if you're trying to figure out if you are ready to call yourself an astrologer or refer to yourself as an astrologer, use integrity. Understand what astrologer means to you, and then don't call yourself an astrologer if you don't think you're there yet. And on that note, I want to talk about some other ways we can refer to ourselves if we don't feel like we are astrologers, whatever that means to you. Now, just like the term astrologer, these other terms and titles I'm going to run through really quickly are self-defined, self-appointed, and totally not required. I've heard a lot of people use these terms. They're not uncommon. I didn't make them up, but I'm just going to run through some of them and give you sort of my loose definitions, my own understanding of kind of what they mean and how we can use them. I'm not proposing that these be official titles that everyone should use. I don't care what you use, but if some of these resonate with you and you feel good about using them, I hope that you will, and I hope it allows you to inject some clarity into your own perspective and into the way you communicate that to your friends and peers and the community at large. First, enthusiast. If you're an astrology enthusiast, I envision this as somebody who has a passion for astrology, they're super into it, they love it, but they're not really planning to dedicate themselves to study, mastery, or they're not trying to become a professional astrologer or anything. A hobbyist, in my mind, is much like an enthusiast, where they're really into astrology, but they do a little bit more classwork, they like to do webinars and stuff, but mainly they're just trying to gain proficiency so they can use astrology for themselves and for their friends and family and understand their transits, etc. Generally not trying to become a professional or get super into study and mastery. Next, and most obvious, is student. To me, an astrology student is somebody who is dedicated to the study of astrology, and they aim to be as proficient as possible and to become a professional astrologer. But some people consider themselves lifelong serious students. That's totally cool too. And now the one, astrologer with a capital A. The way I think of this, and this is key, remember, we're self-defining, I'm just telling you my opinion here. I would consider this someone who engages with astrology regularly, publicly, and with a high level of proficiency, whether or not they're being paid for this astrology work or not. Examples of this would be people who see clients, people who write astrology for some publication, people who write prolifically but maybe don't do it for a publication and don't get paid for it, people who translate astrological texts, financial and mundane astrologers, even people who disseminate quality information to a large social media following. I would consider these people astrologers. This is figures on Astro Twitter, Instagram, etc. I don't want to get too far off on a digression, but this is where my mind has opened up the most, and it was in large part actually influenced by Chris Brennan. When I first joined Astro Twitter a couple years ago, Chris was online engaging with a bunch of people that I, at that time, would not consider astrologers with a capital A. And he was calling them astrologers, and he was really respecting what they did and looking at what they were doing with fresh eyes. And it really inspired me to show up more for that part of the community and really give them a chance that maybe I wouldn't have before. So thank you, Chris, for being a great leader in our community and being open-minded. And yeah, I really think that people who are disseminating quality information, that's the key. There are a lot of people who just do a lot of shitty stuff on the internet, like just memes that don't even make sense. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about people who make threads and informative posts that are basically teaching astrology beginners the ropes of just basic astrological practice. I would consider these people astrologers. I will note that a lot of people in this kind of position consider themselves students or don't consider themselves astrologers, which is totally fine, but I just wanted to kind of clarify around that. Next, professional astrologer. This is kind of what it sounds like. I would consider a professional astrologer somebody who does astrology work for money as their main profession or a main part of their vocation or source of income. Examples would be people who see clients for money, like I said, writers who write all the time and get paid for it for some publication, translators, teachers, etc. Basically people who are doing astrology professionally. Go figure. So Caitlin used the term seasoned astrologer in her thread, and I want to touch on that really quick. It's not officially part of the list, but whatever. So there are astrologers, people who are doing astrology regularly, proficiently, whether they're paid or not. There's professional astrologers who are doing it as a profession. And then there are the really seasoned astrologers. Not every professional astrologer is seasoned, in my opinion. A seasoned astrologer would be somebody who has been doing this for a long time. They have time on their side with the amount of experience they have. They have their own unique takes and their own nuances that they add to their practice because they've been doing it enough to do so. And people who are at a very high level of proficiency. They're probably and usually prolific writers, teachers, many of them have books published, etc. Names that immediately come to mind are people like Kelly Surtees, Austin Coppock, Chris Brennan. Like everybody kind of knows who these people are, and they've been doing this for long enough that it's not just that they know their stuff, like they're seasoned practitioners. They're very, very good at what they do. And then there are the legends like Stephen Forrest, Demetra George, Robert Hand. Like you could just even go onto that next legendary tier of astrologers. Maybe they should be called legendary astrologers. But when you're looking at somebody who's not just an astrologer, they're really something special. And there really is that huge range. There are the enthusiasts, hobbyists, students, people who do astrology a lot, astrologers, the professionals, and then these top-notch people that inspire us all. To wrap this up, my goal here is not to tell anybody what to think. It's to tell people to think. Think these things through. Ask yourself the hard questions if you haven't already. Use integrity when you decide how you're going to refer to yourself or whether or not you're going to don some title or not. Use discernment when you're trying to figure out who's legit and who's not, who has credibility and who doesn't. And talk about it. We don't need these things to drift in the periphery of the astrological community, because when we don't have clarity on these things as a community, we can't speak to these matters to people who are not in our community. This is becoming super important as more and more mainstream media outlets pick up stories about astrology. There is no one right way or one definition of astrologer, but we can bring this up and bring it to the forefront of our conversations with our friends and our peers. It's more than worth it to do so. Whether you like it or not, if you fall on any range of this spectrum that I kind of loosely described earlier, you are a representative of the astrological community. Whether we're enthusiasts or students or professionals or anywhere in between, when people look at astrology from the outside, we are the ones, each and every one of us, showing people what astrology is and what astrologers are. So let's make each other proud. Let's just use integrity and discernment with this, and let's talk about it more. Thank you so much for watching. This is a really important topic to me. It's been coming up a lot lately, and I've honestly been thinking about it for years since I got more involved on Twitter. So if you have any questions for me, or if you'd like me to clarify anything, let me know in the comments below. I want to hear what you think about this whole thing. Do you call yourself an astrologer? Do you call yourself an enthusiast? What do you think? So thank you again for watching. Be sure you're following me on Instagram and Twitter to stay updated for the next videos, and I will see you next time.